What's going on, guys? Today I'm going to show you how to prep a rusty chassis for paint. So I'm going to say this right up front. Painting a rusty chassis because of rust problems is not your best course of action. Any of you that have followed my channel for any length of time know that I'm real big into lanolin and oil undercoating. That by far is going to be the best route for a daily driver. I don't care if it's plow truck, semi truck, anything that's on the road on a consistent basis. That is going to be your best course of action, not what I'm showing you in this video. I have other videos that I'll put links to up in the corner and down in the description of how to properly undercoat a rusty chassis with lanolin or some sort of oil. So paint isn't a good option for a daily driver because of the high amount of labor involved. So guys, if you look behind me, the transmission's out, drive shaft, rear axle, whole rear suspension, fuel tank, fuel lines, emergency brake cables, all that stuff has been removed from the back of this car so I could paint it. I can coat the bottom of this car with lanolin with everything in place and no prep work in an hour. I'm probably gonna have 50 hours roundabouts in this paint job by the time I remove everything, reinstall everything, do the rust mitigation, prep for paint, do the painting, the masking, all that stuff. I'm probably gonna have about 50 hours in this paint job. I can coat it with lanolin in an hour. That lanolin undercoat will last 1 year. So I could coat this car with lanolin 50 times for the amount of labor that it's gonna cost me to coat it, to do it with paint. So that is why I always push the lanolin option, because it's so much quicker and easier than what I'm showing you in this video. With that said, there's a bunch of people out there that have utility trailers, farm implements, or cars they want to restore, something that isn't going to be driven every day, that they want to know how to go about dealing with the rust on those things. So that is what we're going to go over in this video. Now the car we're talking about in this video, this car is not daily driven. This car sees rain maybe 3 to 5 times a year, and I probably put 2,000 to 3,000 miles on it each summer. It never sees any sort of salt, and like I said, barely sees rain. So really, this is kind of the ideal candidate to do something with paint, because I don't really want an oily undercarriage, quite frankly, because it doesn't need to be. So step one of this procedure is going to be disassemble a car. So for this car in particular, I removed the transmission, drive shaft, rear axle, rear suspension, the exhaust, fuel lines, brake lines, fuel tank, all this stuff to open up the bottom of this car so I can paint it. Now my other option, if you're going to leave all that stuff in place, is you're going to have to mask it all off. So you're either going to spend time masking this stuff off or removing it. And if you remove it, you're going to get a better, quality paint job. So taking a look underneath here, guys, it's all solid. As you can see, there's no big rust holes or anything like that, but I drove this daily for 3 years. I bought this car when I was a senior in high school, and I drove it daily in Northern Ohio for 3 years until I, bought another vehicle. So I bought this car with 22,000 miles on it. It was 6 years old at that time, and I've owned it ever since. It currently has about 70,000 miles on it, and this is what it looks like. But like I said, it never goes out in the winter anymore, so that's how I can justify painting it like I am. So with that, the first thing I'm going to do is get underneath here with a pressure washer and wash off the fluid film that I sprayed on it and all that stuff, get it back down to a bare surface with nothing on it. All right, so what I'm doing here is I have a large electric pressure washer, and I am pressure washing the bottom of this car. Now you want to pressure wash and clean whatever you're going to be sanding on and ultimately painting, because if there's any grease, oil, dirt, anything like that you leave on the surface, and then you hit that grease, oil, or dirt with your sanding disc or your stripping disc, that dirt embeds itself in the pad or the strip disc, and then you're just going to smear that dirt and grease all over the bottom of the car or all over the trailer you're working on or whatever. So the idea is I'm getting all of the grease, oil, old fluid film, any loose paint, I'm blowing all that stuff off of the surface. So I did one preliminary wash, and then what I did was I got Simple Green and I diluted it 1 to 1 with water. So 1 part Simple Green, 1 part water. and I put it in a spray bottle. Sprayed the bottom of the car, let it sit 5 minutes or so, and then went through with a scrub brush and actually scrubbed the bottom of this car with a scrub brush to try and remove any more grease, oil, dirt, anything that I could. Get as much of it off as you can. And then I went through and did a final rinse with the pressure washer. So after I did the final rinse with the pressure washer, I let this thing sit overnight and came back to it the next morning, and that's when I actually started stripping the rust and actually working on the chassis. So before we get started, these are the tools that I'm really going to be using to strip this chassis. Starting over here on the right, probably by far the most useful tool, believe it or not, is going to be a little pneumatic die grinder, because it's so small you can get it into a lot of the tight spots, and you can get it a lot more places than where you can get the 4.5 or the surface finisher. So as far as roll lock discs, I'm just using 60 grit. If you go too coarse, like you drop down to 36, you're going to start really gouging the metal. And if you're going for a smooth finish, I wouldn't even go with 60 grit. I would probably go with 80, and then you'd probably want to sand it with 120 or 220 to try and level out the metal. So like I said, don't go too coarse with the sanding disc, because it will show through the paint job. The most useful tool of the three is going to be the 4.5-inch angle grinder with a stripping disc. The reason I say this is because my situation is kind of unique. Because I'm working on the bottom of this car that's up on a lift, I'm holding this die grinder or this angle grinder up over my head for long periods of time. And of the three, you can cover the most ground with this, and it weighs the least. So for me, this is by far the most useful setup, but you can't get it into the tight corners like you can with the die grinder. So these two by far are going to be the most useful for you. Next thing I tried, which probably was a mistake, was a surface finish tool with a wire brush on it. Now in theory, this thing should work great because the drum's so big, you should be able to cover a large area very, very quickly. But unfortunately, this thing probably weighs like 8 pounds, and holding 8 pounds over your head for about 3 hours at a time gets pretty freaking tiring. So I really didn't use this thing all that much, because the 4.5-inch angle grinder was just so much quicker, so much lighter, and so much easier to use. If you look at a lot of the videos online advertising this thing, they're using it on like a hood or a fender or some sort of exterior part of a car that is a large flat area. Nowhere with any sort of tight corners, and they're certainly not holding it up over their head. There's a reason for that. Finally, you can always use just a regular wire wheel on the end of a drill if you guys obviously don't have the rest of this stuff. You can get the job done. It's just going to take you longer. But like I said, of the three, the 4.5-inch angle grinder, you can cover the most area. It weighs the least, and it's pretty much by far the cheapest of the three to buy. One more thing before we get started is going to be PPE. You're going to need a respirator for this, guys. If you're doing this in any sort of enclosed space, there's going to be a ton of rust and paint and stuff like that flying around in the air. You do not want to be breathing that stuff in. Otherwise, you're going to be blowing rust-covered boogers for a couple days. I got a good set of gloves just in case. Makes it a little bit easier, a little bit safer to hold the die grinder. Obviously, a pair of safety glasses. And the other thing I have are some earplugs. I use the real small ones just because I have so much other stuff on my head. It just makes sense to use the small ones rather than the big muffs that go over your ears. So at this point, I've stripped about half of this car. I've got it to right about here or so, and the front half of this car was really not very rusty at all, but I ran into something that I was not expecting at all. So I started grinding away all the rust, as you guys can see, and I ran into something that I was not anticipating. So if you take a look at this section right here that still has the factory electroplating or E-coating on it right here in the middle, there's like some very small bumps in it that I can feel with my fingers. And if I hit this with a grinder, you're gonna see there's actually rust spots underneath the E-coating. Like if you look over here on the left, you can see where I've already ground this back a little bit, and you can see like there's little
little circles and stuff in the E-coat, because that is where the E-coat no longer has a bond with the metal. So let me show you guys. I'll hit this with a grinder, and there's way more rust underneath this than what you think there is. See what I'm talking about here, guys? All that's rust. So if you just scuff this E-coat and paint it, you still have rust underneath the E-coat, so the paint job wouldn't do you one bit of good. I was not anticipating this to happen, so unfortunately, I'm gonna have to do way more grinding on this thing than what I originally thought I was going to. What had happened was, at some point, a pinhole had developed in the E-coat. Moisture got inside the pinhole and started to rust the metal. Now, when I say find rust, this is not massive rust we're talking about. We're talking about rust an 1/8 inch in diameter, just surface rust that I was grinding off. But if you're gonna paint over the top of that, you need to be able to treat it with some sort of phosphoric acid and things like that. So I stripped the majority of the paint off the bottom of this car. Like I said, it took me about 3 hours to do half of it. Now, one thing I can tell you is I understand I'm in a very fortunate situation and I'm doing this on a lift, and not many people have that same luxury. But one thing I can tell you is, when you're working on a lift and you're working over your head, you're looking directly up, holding a grinder over your head, and you do that for 3 hours, and I'm gonna tell you right now, your neck is gonna kill you. Your arms are gonna be sore. And really what I did was, I would work for an hour, take a half-hour break, work for an hour, take a half-hour break, because at the end of the day, at the end of the 3 hours, my neck was killing me from basically just looking straight up and then holding a 3 or 4 pound grinder over your head for 3 hours. So as you can imagine, this is super labor intensive. I'm not gonna show you me running a grinder for 3 hours, because if you've seen me run a grinder for about 20 seconds, you've pretty much seen me run a grinder for 3 hours. But yeah, so I'm gonna set the camera up and put it on time lapse and keep working away at this thing. So as far as the grinding is concerned, guys, it really doesn't take much to remove the factory E-coat on this particular car. I didn't really get any close-up shots of doing any of the grinding, simply because I didn't want to shoot a bunch of shrapnel at my camera. So this is about the only shot you're gonna get as far as, me doing grinding and stuff like that. As far as the rust removal, I removed as much rust as I could. What I mean by that is, yeah, I could sit here and grind and grind and grind and grind, and I would have no metal left, but I wouldn't have any rust either. Basically what I was doing was, I'm knocking off all the loose rust scale, any of the rust that's kind of on the outside of the metal, and there's still gonna be some rust down in the pits of the metal, if that makes sense. So down in the pits of the rust, there's still gonna be a little bit of rust in there, but all the stuff that's out on the surface is getting all ground off. As I went through and continued doing this procedure, it was becoming apparent that even the small die grinder wasn't going to get into some of the spots that I needed to get into, and I really didn't want to have to get out my portable sandblaster, but unfortunately I did, and I only used it on the really tight spots. Now, I could have used this 100% on the whole chassis, and it would have been a spectacular job. But I would have also had 2 inches of sand inside my toolbox. So that wasn't something that I wanted. So I used the sandblaster sparingly, and I only really used it on the super tight areas where I couldn't get a grinder. So after you get whatever you're working on, wiped down with some lacquer thinner or wax and grease remover, the last thing we're gonna do is actually treat the rust with some sort of phosphoric acid. So all these products that I'm showing you right here are all phosphoric acid based. As far as rust converters are concerned, the phosphoric acid rust converters work much better than the things like Corosil and like the VHT and some of that other stuff that you're going to see out on the market. I've actually tested rust converters in a separate video. I'll put a card up in the corner if you guys want to check that out. But I've tested all these 4 right here. They all work fantastic. If I was to recommend one out of these 4, I would probably recommend the Rust-Oleum Rust Dissolver, because it's a gel. It'll kind of cling to the surface of whatever you're dealing with.
Whereas something like the Ospo that's, super thin, and being that I'm using this, upside down on the bottom of a car, the Ospo is just going to run right off the surface, whereas the Rust-Oleum is going to cling and kind of stay there and continue to work. Now, as far as what I'm going to be using on this particular car, I'm actually going to be using this phosphoric acid product from Master Coat. The reason I'm using this particular product is it's because it's a part of the same paint line as the paint that I'm going to be using. So I want to make sure that, obviously I don't have any compatibility issues with the acid and the paint. Therefore, I'm sticking with, the same paint line to make sure I don't have any problems. With that said, the Ospo works great, Rust Cutter works great, the Star Brite Rust Eater works great. My choice of these four is going to be the Rust-Oleum, but like I said, I'm just trying to stay in the same paint line.
So to apply the phosphoric acid, what I'm doing is I'm kind of breaking this undercarriage down into sections. And what I'm doing is I'll spray down a section of the undercarriage, let the phosphoric acid sit on, the bare metal, the paint, and the rust. Just let it sit there and work for a minute or two. And then what I'll do is I'll take a red scuff pad and I'm going to scuff the surface of the metal, the paint, and then as well as the rust. And what that's going to do, ultimately, what it's going to do is help break down the rust, help dissolve the rust, and help any existing rust that's in the pores of the metal be converted into iron phosphate. The final thing that this is going to do is this is also going to leave a chemical etch on the metal, on the rust, and on the paint. And what this chemical etch is going to do is help create good adhesion between the primer and the bare metal. The best suggestion that I can give you regarding these phosphoric acid products is just simply read the instructions on the bottle. Some of these products require like a water wash after you're done to neutralize the acid. Other products like the one I'm using, I spray it a second time and wipe it off with a clean rag, and then that etches the surface. The other thing that you need to pay attention to is going to be the primer that you're using. You need to make sure that the primer that you're using is going to play nicely with phosphoric acid. If it's not, you need to find either the right primer or the right prep solution so there's no incompatibility problems. So what we're taking a look at now is just the difference that this phosphoric acid treatment makes on rust. So what we're looking at here is what this section of the frame looked like before I treated it with phosphoric acid. So you can see there's still some rust there. I can't grind 100% of that stuff off. But if I flip over and look at the other photo afterward, you can see there is a drastic difference between before and after. So here's another picture that I have. This is, kind of the same area. This is right behind the passenger side rear tire. This area got hit with a ton of salt, a ton of road grime. As you can see, it's got some rust. Because of the intricate shape of this area, you can't necessarily get a grinder into every single part. And I really didn't want to get the sandblaster in here because I didn't want to fill the trunk full of sand. So by treating it with phosphoric acid, take a look at the difference before and after. As you can see, it's huge.
All right, guys, so here's the finished product. I mean, as you can see, it's not spotless, but the rust that you do see has been converted into iron phosphate, which has that dark appearance to it. It doesn't have that orange rusty color. It's all the rust that is still on the vehicle has been converted into iron phosphate, which is, real dark. So at this point, I'm ready for paint. As far as the prep, all the prep is done. I do have to do some additional masking and stuff, but as far as, the bottom of the vehicle is concerned, as far as the rust is concerned, we're done. So I'm probably gonna do some masking tomorrow in between videos, and then what I'll do is I'm gonna bring you guys back for part 2, and we're gonna get some paint on this thing.
Now, just for reference, this is what we started with. I understand it's not super rusty. There's no giant rust holes in anything or anything like that, but this, guys, is a very good real-world example of how to paint rusty metal that is solid. If you have rusty metal that you can stick a screwdriver through it, or you have giant rot holes in it, putting a coat of paint on it isn't going to fix it. You need new metal. This procedure will work on any metal that is solid, but it has existing surface rust on it. So that's how I'm going to leave things for part 1. Part 2 is actually going to be painting, but in between part 1 and part 2, I'm going to mask everything off. I'm going to make, like a quasi sort of paint booth around the bottom of the car so I can, sort of contain the overspray. The primer that I'm going to be using that Master Coat Master Series primer. The top coat that I'm going to be doing on top of that is going to be Raptor liner. So I'm probably going to do, the second part is going to be the primer slash, the paint, and then I'm probably going to do like a separate video on how to spray Raptor liner if you guys are interested in Raptor liner. So that's where we're at going forward. If you guys, want to see all that content, go down and hit the subscribe button. But as always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, like I said, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.